go ahead and start.
I did my best to not breathe on your computers.
Okay.
So, when was this again?
This was last week. I want to say maybe towards the beginning of the week.
Okay.
Yeah.
And what led up to it? Had they done critique?
We were going to do our first round of critiques.
Okay.
So they had written a blog entry, and I wanted them to get critiqued on the blog entry.
Mm-hmm.
And so I was going to have them, instead of, typically with blogs, I have them comment and do that kind of critique process, but because this was their very first time, I asked them to print out their blogs.
Okay.
Because they were going to hand that entry to someone else to do the critiques. So after all of this, after we had this conversation, there was a series of 4 questions that I asked them to journal about. The first one was, why is getting our work critiqued? How can getting our work critiqued be scary? So that was the first question. The second question was, why is it important to get our work critiqued? The third was, what kind of feedback do we want to see on our work? Mm-hmm. And then the last was, what kind of statements are not helpful in critiques? So then they had a journal about all of those, and then...
That was before this?
This was right after this.
Right after, okay.
Because I wanted them to see the critique process and what that looks like on paper and feels like, and how he was working with me on my writing, and that's why I set up the questions after, because I didn't know where everyone's critique experience had been, so I thought I'd give them a sample of a critique.
It is a great example of 9th grade innocence as well.
Yeah.
So wait, there's a teacher of teachers who comes here?
Exactly. Wait, so what does that mean?
And I thought your follow-up with that was really great. We said professionals get their work critiqued, they get it edited, and someone looks at it, and a couple of kids are like, oh, yeah.
That's right.
A great little revelation.
Mm-hmm.
What struck you out of when you watched this?
I was really impressed by what they created out of the feedback. Mm-hmm. After seeing the critiques and me asking them the questions of what it was that they noticed, I was really impressed with the categories that they were coming up with on critiques. And I was like, I didn't think that I was going to get those responses, and I was definitely impressed by the responses that they were giving me. On the flip side, I battled after watching this in trying to figure out whether or not we should have done small group stuff beforehand, before having the large group, because even though I had various people constantly participating, there was still students who didn't participate. And so I don't know if they were participating by actively listening or if they were zoned out. I have no idea. And that's the part that I left with uncomfortable after watching the video. But my fear was in having them do the group discussion first. I feared that they weren't going to be able to come up with the list that we came up with, having, giving an answer and then people picking up on those answers and hearing where it was going. So that was my fear, that it was going to be more on a superficial level critique, discussing what they saw, than really dive deeply into it.
And that's an interesting question, because it's you want thinking to happen,
right?
You want them to be engaged,
right?
And it sounds like there was a fear that even though there might be more engagement in one sense, there might be less thinking if they started off on the wrong track.
Right.
Okay.
Right.
Huh.
And then there's also, in the group process, even when I remember the first week of school, I did the final word, reading activity, and there were still students that were even in that process where they had, you were directly assigned to do it, to be speaking right now, they were very, very short and simple, were still not necessarily had a whole lot to say. So that was also my thinking, and having that experience that I was made me really question it. But yeah, and then just like I said, the piece on even though there was people from tables talking and participating, then was it full participation, whether through actively listening?
So who's internalizing this?
Right.
Who's internalizing this kind of
Yeah.
So were they, well, I'll get to that in a second. So I wonder too with that first piece, if it were structured in a way that, like you said, if small groups first, I wonder if, so there's Milo and
Macy.
And then Vincent doing something. Every time you'd write on the board, and then you turn around and it was like, well, you guys, you know, you're on video right here. She's gonna watch this.
Yeah.
And I wonder if, it's like as far as that engagement thing piece goes, if you know if they are together in a small group, like you said, if different groups would have come up with different things, or if they came up with their top three, all groups would have came up with the three same three examples.
Yeah.
And it's I don't know. And then I also wonder is like as you mentioned, it's like how do we know who got it?
Right.
And would they get it more through that small group or more through the large group?
Right.
Or what is there anything you can think of doing in small groups immediately following the big discussion to help people internalize it?
We did after they did the prompts, the 4 prompts that I gave them, in their groups they had to share their answers. So why the first one, you know, and I facilitate that. So first person, why can critiquing be scary? So then you would share, and then next person would share why critiquing could be scary for them. Why is critique, you know, so we shared all of those answers in our small groups, and then after that process, they put those answers collectively onto a poster.
Okay, cool.
So as a group, and then we brought those and presented those to everyone.
So everyone's engaging with this on their own level, and then they're bringing it back together.
Right.
Okay.
So I did that group process after the journals. So.
Cool. And your question initially was this helpful? How do you think it was helpful?
I thought so. We had our first really big critique today, and you know I set it up with talking about remember some of the things that we saw. Let's look at that list again. Your paper should look just like Dr. Junn's, you know, like don't be afraid to like look at, you know, write all over this. If it's empty, you're not doing it right, you know, because even if they're doing something really well, we know that we need to comment on that,
right.
You know, and so we had that conversation today, and just, they took their drafts home today with their critiques, but even just walking around, like I saw a lot of comments on the actual things. So there was definitely visually a lot there. So I could tell that they used that model and were like copying it, you know, like making sure that they were giving lots of comments and feedback, and in that sense, whether it was a reaction that they had to it, needed something clarified, or whatnot. So, and then, you know, aside from the critique sheet, I said you're not even touching the critique sheet until you have read this paper and actively engaged with it.
What is the critique sheet?
The critique sheet is definitely more like, okay, what was the moment that changed their life? Like, did you get that? What were parts where, like, it asked them to pull pieces of their writing. So, like, where were parts where you really felt an emotional connection? So, let's bring that out. Give me samples and, you know, directly quote it with that they used figurative language. So then, or, you know, any literary devices, and they had to pull a quote from their thing, from that person's paper, and then write it down and put simile or onomatopoeia, or, you know, so those kind of things in that process. And then it was the last parts where, you know, like, what did you really appreciate about the writer? What were things that you think could help improve the work? And then what are things that you would like to replicate from this writer in your own work? You know, so anything that struck you about their writing that you felt you could use in your work.
Cool.
So.
And so when you did that today, right? Sorry, my brain is on.
Yeah.
It's cold. Did they revisit the list of qualities of good critique?
Yep, that's what we did before we even like traded. So
I was really impressed with how they were. It was only, you had to be an audience to critique in order to be an audience to the work of other students.
Right.
And I was really impressed with their collective ability to be an audience of critique.
Right.
To look at critique and say, I like this because.
Yeah. Yeah.
Which is really, wow, that's impressive.
Yeah. Or even like Carly, who picked up on the idea of like man, if he would have just focus on all the negative, like, that can really hurt someone's self-esteem.
Yeah,
like,
right.
Yeah, like, exactly. Yes, you know, and it was just, like, I was definitely impressed with their answers.
Yeah.
It's like, okay, now we can only take that and channel it into critiques.
Yeah. It's interesting, that whole, so this is I think this is Rob's language, and I might just be mixing it up with something else, but he talks about the difference between, in order for students to become critics, they have to be able to be an audience first. And I think for me, it was like really, really powerful, and I'm thinking of food critic. A food critic is not born critiquing food. They're born and they eat food, and at some point they go, "Oh, this is really good." And then they start to go, "Well, why is this good?" It's like, well, it's a little salty, it's a little spicy.
Yeah.
And then they recognize we have 5 taste buds, 5 taste senses, whatever they are: salty, sweet, bitter, sour, and picante. And puts them together and goes, "This, I recognize it's good, and here's how it's good.
Yeah.
And now I can taste other people's food,
Right.
and tell them what I feel about it," which is it's like, framing it that way. It's like, yeah, this is a great example of being that audience before being that critic.
Yeah. Definitely. And today the critique that they did was on a vignette for a moment that has shaped who they are today. And so we talked again about the culture piece of it, and like, why again could this be really scary to get this piece critiqued, especially?
Now, did you assume people would be afraid of it, or did some people say, "I'm afraid of having more critiqued"?
Well, we had talked already about like why critiquing could be so scary, and I shared with them my vignette of my moment in time, and I talked to them about how, like, yeah, it was scary exposing that to them because that was so personal to me, and so I didn't know how they would react, and I was doing it in the sense to get them to not just trade a paper with someone, but know that they can trust that person, because it is such a personal topic, whether it's on one end of the emotional spectrum or the other, that they're sharing a piece of them. Yeah. And so they talked about, because it's so personal, or this is a moment that changed who we are, and we don't want that person to judge us or look at us differently or say anything about it. And then we talked about fears, like, okay, what are some fears that you guys have? And, those things came up where I fear that someone may judge me for what I have to say. I fear that they might think of me differently, or, go and talk about this to someone else. And so we talked about, like, trust and having a culture of trust on our team. And so I told them I wasn't going to assign them anybody to trade with, that they could pick someone that they trusted in their small groups within their table mates, because they had already kind of gotten to know those people pretty well. And I had an interesting situation today with James and Marshmallow. And Michael Dela Cruz goes by Marshmallow. And it was naturally left for those two to kind of trade. And I said, okay, well, Marshmallow, you gave your paper to James. James, do you want to give your paper to Marshmallow? And he's like, no. And I said, why not? He's like, because I don't trust him.
Wow.
And Marshmallow's sitting directly in front of him, and I'm looking at Anna, and I'm like, oh, okay. I want to talk about this. Marshmallow, do you trust James with your paper now? And he's like, yes. So then it was a really, really powerful, so we gave Marshmallow someone else's, really cool conversation that I pulled James aside, and I said, why don't you trust Marshmallow? Did he ever do anything? He was like, no, but the way that he presents himself in class, very, very class clownish, very much the class clown in our class. He's like, I feel like if he were to read my vignette, then he would maybe mock me or make fun of me. And I said, okay, did he ever do anything to lose your trust? He's like, no. And I said, okay, would you feel comfortable telling Marshmallow that? He's like, okay.
Wow.
And then so I went inside and I pulled Marshmallow out, and I said, okay, Marshmallow, James went in, I said, Marshmallow, Anna and I were talking, and we were trying to figure out why James wouldn't be comfortable with your work, and we thought maybe because the way that you present yourself in class. And I have had several conversations with Marshmallow about this, like, toning it down, like, relax, like, keep your hands to yourself, like, it's time to focus, those kind of conversations. And I'm like, and we were talking about how you're very much the class clown, and so your classmates are viewing you as that, but they don't know how great of a student you really are. So unfortunately, the class clowns have this, rap to be, very, very poor students, not strong at all. And I'm like, but you have really good grades. I go, but I'm feeling like people are perceiving you as not. And I said, and, I think that's kind of the case with James, but James would like to speak with you if you don't mind.
James
like,
was listening to this?
No, James was not present. So then I pulled James out. He said, you haven't lost my trust. I just feel like if I would have given you my paper, then you would have maybe made fun of me because you're always joking around in class. And Marshmallow's reaction to that was he was just so serious and so focused. And he said, man, I'm sorry, like if, you didn't think that I could, and I hope that, you can grow to trust me. I said, awesome, great. And he's like, okay, well, thank you. So then I asked Marshmallow to stay to just kind of touch up with him because I saw he was taking it very heavy. And I said, Marshmallow, this is what I fear is that, now or 10 years from now when you're in your career, you might miss opportunities because people don't think that you can handle them because you give off this personality of like, completely free and, you're joking around, not focusing. And he's like, I appreciate that he was honest with me to let me know that.
Wow.
And I said, okay, I think you should really go ahead and go tell him that. So he went inside and was like, I appreciate you letting me know that. And I could tell that he just internalized that because, it was just so shocking for me to hear that from James, be like, no, I don't trust him. And, for Marshmallow to be like, whoa, okay. So, that was part of that piece on, like, why getting our work critique could be so scary that I followed the prompt up, that lecture with, so.
Wow.
Yeah.
Which one, was he in the video?
Marshall, not, he was in my morning class, yeah.
Okay.
So.
Wow. And you're that's just tremendous. It's just another example of how you build every year a tremendous community in your class. It's awesome. And it's only, what, week 3, 4, whatever it is.
4 or 5. I don't know. It's been a while. We're in there.
We're trying to figure out how many days we had today. It's like, what is today? Because there's kids that have missed, they've been absent, tardy 10 times. Is that 10 out of how many?
Yeah. The other piece that I was, when I had met with Christina, my original Christina, I had talked about just like this bigger question that I don't know how it comes into play, but
The confidence thing.
the confidence piece with students that are outside of the village. And then when I debriefed it again this last time, I was paying attention to who was participating and who was giving out the answers. And I think it was even more heavier weighted on the students from outside of High Tech High.
They were giving the critique.
They were giving the responses that I was writing up on the boards. Kimberly, Tiana, Onisha, Carly, like Tristan and Tanner and Matthew are middle schoolers. And so I was like, oh. But then there's like all of those other voices that are just not present. You know what I mean?
I think your instinct, though, of going back to your question before, of having them do something in the small group before sharing with the large group, I think you're right on. Because I think some of that will come out.
Yeah.
You'd have to thoughtfully structure that.
Yeah.
It's like, is everyone writing their own thing down and then sharing it? Are we as a group of 4 just coming up with our top 3?
Yeah.
But I think there's something to that as far as that, in getting at the question of who's from the village and who's not from the village, and just with the engagement piece.
Yeah.
Because those insights were so brilliant, and it's like, wow, I wonder how many individuals or how many groups of 4 would come up with some of these.
Right.
And if they came up with them on their own, would they be more internalized, even more internalized, than if someone's coming up with them and they're going, I see that.
Right. Right. Yeah.
And a piece of that too is I always wonder this, and it's hard. I always wonder when a teacher writes on the board if a student could do it. Because it frees you up to move around and hear what's going on.
Yeah.
And I just had a conversation with Ben. Said he had a student in his advisory acting as scribe, and was this really stellar student and an upperclassman, and she was writing what she wanted without checking for understanding.
Yeah.
And he's like, I forgot you gotta train someone to be the scribe.
Yeah,
It's like,
that's
this is what I heard, is that correct? And,
Yeah.
anyway,
Absolutely.
I'm always intrigued by that, of how much, of when that's going to free us up and when it's going to
Yeah.
end up somewhere we don't want.
Right.
If someone's not skilled enough to be the scribe.
Yeah, it's a hard balance. It's the risk. So, yeah.
So have you seen other manifestations of village kids being more confident this year, or is that more lingering from last year?
Right now, I'm going to say that it's definitely more present right now because I'm closer right now, at the beginning of the year and those students.
Yeah.
But, there's just, I feel like by this point, other years, I was able to get more of those kids to, break out of their shell.
Huh.
Whereas, Brandon Labra, who came from King Chavez, is very, very, very quiet. And he was in that group sitting down by Vincent. And then across from him, Christy, who came from Holly or whatnot. And those two especially are, I think of every time I think of that question.
Do you think they're not out of their shell, or are they just quiet kids?
Me and Trina have both had the conversation with Christy, and she's like, Diana, I love it, but I just don't like to talk in class. I just don't like to talk in class. Okay, well, then how about this? We work on when we're doing small groups, and you are participating in those small groups, And so I'm like, that's the first step I want you to take, is that you're participating in that. Kiara Smith is another one who went to Bell Junior High that I'm just like, man, come on, freak out, Whereas Kiara, I definitely see more on the piece of the confidence part, whereas Christy is right now just very, very shy. Brandon also probably a little piece of confidence there.
What's
too.
Brandon's last name?
Labra.
Labra, okay.
So yeah, what do you think of those three?
But it seems like a good strategy that you say,
Yeah.
okay, if you're not comfortable in the full group, let's work on making sure your voice is heard in the
Right.
small group.
Right.
It's a great step.
Yeah.
So
So we'll see how it goes.
cool. Well, thanks for sharing that. It was awesome.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you very much.
All right.
Alrighty.
And perhaps tomorrow.
Yeah.
I could also